Dr. Figaro, chair of this afternoon's event, esteemed panelists, interpreters, members of the media, colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the staff and students of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, I am pleased to provide opening and welcome remarks at this webinar, Homeward Bound, Navigating Repatriation and Reintegration of Returnees from Syria. I would like to warmly welcome our very distinguished panelists and thank them for their virtual presence and contribution to the public outreach of the Institute of International Relations and by extension, the University of the West Indies. We are also extremely pleased to welcome our distinguished guests and audience to this event. Deepest gratitude to all our old and new friends who are here to listen in and participate. It is good to have you here. In addition to our academic programs, we host public events intended to promote discussions and exchange of ideas on issues of interest and relevance to international relations. These include diplomatic dialogues, panel discussions, special guest lectures, and book launches. The diversity of areas on which we engage highlights, among many things, the multidisciplinary nature of our work and the ability to bridge the gap between theory, practice, and policy. Importantly, these exercises promote our public presence, generate knowledge, and advance the policy relevance of our work. We sometimes execute events collaboratively with both individuals and organizations, including state agencies, high-ranking public officials, private sector organizations, the diplomatic corps, research and policy bodies, national and regional governmental and non-governmental organizations, including civil society. Such events also complement and support our academic programs. That is for our students to hear from practitioners and researchers in order to get an understanding of the real-life applications of issues they may study in related courses. As you may know, the Institute of International Relations offers postgraduate programs. We have 2 masters, we have a postgraduate diploma, as well as an MPhil and PhD in international relations. Also, through the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean, we provide short, existing, and custom-made practical hands-on and professional diplomatic training upon request. To our esteemed panelists, we do not take it for granted that you have taken the time to share your expertise and insights on such an issue of such grave sensitivity and deep concern for governments and the public, nationally, regionally, and internationally. My hope is that at the end of this webinar, we would have contributed to the discussion on sustainable solutions, considering the human rights, interest, and security of not only those who are directly affected, but for the society in general. We look forward very much to balanced and measured presentations and discussions. I wish to acknowledge and thank Dr. Michael Pawinski for his hard and efficient work in initiating and leading the planning of this webinar. Thanks also to Dr. Figaro for chairing this event. We also appreciate the work of the U.W.I, St. Augustine Marketing and Communications Department, and the IR Secretariat, in particular, Ms. Tanisha Charles, in the execution of this event. We are also grateful to our MSc student, Ms. Julia Nichols, who graciously agreed to deliver the vote of thanks. Having said that, I wish to thank everyone for being here and a very productive discussion. I thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are now going to have opening remarks by Ms. Letta Taylor. Ms. Taylor.
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. I apologize for that. Greetings, everyone. It is such an honor to join you today to talk about this incredibly important topic that is the repatriation of Trinidadians who are unlawfully held in horrific conditions in northeast Syria. While it is an honor and an absolute delight to join all of you, it is also for me a moment filled with regret. Regret because a year ago, almost today, my colleague Joe Becker and I of Human Rights Watch visited Trinidad to press the case, to press the government, to press all authorities to return these Trinidadians held in northeast Syria with utmost urgency. And here we are a year later, and almost nothing else, almost no progress has been made. There is a committee that was formed by the government to facilitate the returns of these detainees. And yet the committee itself, this esteemed 3-member panel, members themselves have expressed frustration and said that they feel that they feel stymied, frankly, by the government. I regret because with this passing year, we now have a total of almost 40 countries around the world who have repatriated or continue to repatriate more of their nationals from northeast Syria. Some have even repatriated men in addition to women and children. We are talking about now over 8,000 foreigners who have been brought home for rehabilitation, for reintegration, or for prosecutions and monitoring as appropriate. Yet, tragically, Trinidad is not one of these countries. We have, therefore, we have boys left who I'm sure our esteemed panelists will discuss. Boys left who are becoming men or have become men behind bars. Boys who thought they were going to places like Disneyland and instead were dragged by parents to a war zone to live under the most dangerous cult at that time in the world, trapped, and then trapped again in detention by the so-called liberators of northeast Syria, liberators who helped topple the physical caliphate of ISIS. We have girls who have become women, girls who never knew how to be girls because they had a life of detention and responsibility that no child should ever endure. We have Trinidadian women who are trying to care for their families in camps where there is no clean water, where there is not enough medicine. I work like a dog just to get by, one Trinidadian woman told me, who's supporting several family members there. And of course, back in Trinidad, we have family members who have no idea if their loved ones are well, not well, in some cases, even if they're alive, if they're behind bars, and who despair of ever seeing grandchildren before they become adults, or perhaps of ever seeing their sons and daughters again. It is an international obligation for Trinidad to return its nationals. That's because even though these nationals are overseas, and even because the adults went in many instances of their own, on their own will to join ISIS, many realize that they've made a terrible mistake, and they're all now at threat to, they risk death, they risk infirmity. Their children are living a life of hell that they think will never end. Trinidad, under these circumstances, does have an obligation to repatriate its nationals. But in addition, it has a moral responsibility to these families, to the people of Trinidad, to the Caribbean basin, to the world, to show that it can be a leader, not an outlier, because that's what's happened in the past year or two. Trinidad, a leader in the region, has become an outlier on the repatriations trend, which has been accelerating dramatically in the last couple of years. So this is just to lay the groundwork and to thank you all so much for the opportunity of joining you today, with the hope that that another year will not pass in which we then find ourselves having this exact same conversation. I hope this is the last time we have to have this conversation, and that instead we will be talking about the amazing things that the international community, the government of Trinidad, activists, community leaders are doing to ensure that repatriations and reintegrations are a success, and that Trinidad becomes a role model rather than a laggard on this important topic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Montoot, and then Ms. Taylor. We appreciate you giving us some insight into the issue of repatriation, especially of Trinidadians in Syria. But we also have a panel of experts that will weigh in and provide information, introduction into some of the issues that they're contending with. And their experiences hopefully will foster our thinking and our knowledge and our skill sets in terms of understanding this repatriation process, but not only repatriation process, but the reintegration of these detainees, especially based on their experiences. So we have 5 experts in this field that are going to give us pertinent information. And one of these experts is Shamas Ahmed, and he is actually at the head office of displaced persons and refugees of the Autonomous Administration in North and East Syria. And he does amazing work because he coordinates the organizational work of those who are in camps in both in North and East Syria. Our second panelist is Poonam Taneja, and she is an investigative reporter with BBC London News in London. And what she does is really interesting because she looks at human affairs, security, people, which she specializes in race, and as well as look at things from a global aspect, so all the global affairs. And she has worked with countries including Afghanistan, Syria, so she'll be able to give us some fulfilling information about her experiences. Our next panelist is Mr. Patricio Galvez, and he is the coordinator of cultural projects and specialized lecturer in children's fundamental rights. So you can talk about the children and their experiences, actual radicalization, and especially the role of authorities in incidences of crisis as well as conflict situations. So we welcome you, Dr. Galvez. We also have Sarita Ashraf, and she's a barrister with the International Criminal Law. And she also provides a stance and expert advice on gender competency, intersectional analyses of the commission and impact of international crimes. And so she'll be able to give us some pertinent information with regards to the war in Syria based on her publications, Between Justice and Political Reality. So we welcome you. And our last panelist, our final panelist, will be Dr. Timothy Alfonso. He's actually Deputy Dean at the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies. And his information, his background will set us apart because he provides information. He is the director of the Caribbean Center of Human Rights, and he'll probably have pertinent information regarding international law and his experiences within that center and the research that they're undertaking. So all panelists, we welcome you. At the end of these panel sessions, we would have a question and answer. So if you do have any questions, please keep them in mind, and I would also be able to provide them with any responses or assistance at this point in time. So we have our first panelist, and we would like to welcome him. So we have now Mr. Sharif Ahmed.
Hello everyone. A special thanks for the Institute of International Relations and everyone participating in this event. Highlighting the situation and the reality of the camps, and especially the whole camp and ISIS-linked families, which still pose a danger not only on the region but on the whole international community. Unfortunately, since 2019, and after defeating ISIS on the ground, the international community has failed in fulfilling its duties toward the SDF and the Autonomous Administration, except several humanitarian organizations, several NGOs, which still help the Autonomous Administration and the SDF, but according to their capabilities. The inaction of the international community, especially the concerned state, which have citizens in the whole camp and families in the whole camp, despite the calls of the autonomous administration to find a solution for this complicated issue, in terms of humanitarian and security, to find a solution and fulfill their duty regarding the peoples of Northeast Syria. As you know, since 2019 up to now, ISIS is still reorganizing its ranks, in addition to spreading the ideology of ISIS and raising kids on the basis of this ideology. In addition to women who also play a role in spreading this ideology. Of course, there's a support, international and regional support to this organization. We in the autonomous administration see that these kids, who are about 30,000 kids, they are the third generation and the most dangerous one in the history of the terrorist organization. The first generation was in the 80s, was Al-Qaeda, and in 2013 and 14 was ISIS, which was more dangerous than Al-Qaeda, but we are not aware that this case could be the third generation and the most dangerous one in the history of the terrorist organization, and their danger will cause a humanitarian disaster not only on the region but on the whole international community. Now, in the whole camp, there are citizens belong to more than 45 to 50 states, and their goal is to create chaos and go back to their countries and create problems and security issues, as this organization sees that they are right and all the peoples of the whole world are infidels and they need to fight them and eliminate them. Several countries have repatriated some citizens of them, but this is not a complete solution. We see this is not like the final solution for this issue. The solution lays in forming new programs, reorganize the camp, and establishing rehabilitation centers in support with the international community, and supporting the autonomous administration with staff that can rehabilitate the kids and the women. In addition to the imposed embargo on our region on the northeast Syria, where there was like from the north by Turkey and its backed militias, and from the south by the regime and the Iranian militias. Our region is connected with the outside with just and only one cross border, which is the Arabia cross border. And unfortunately, after agreements among the regional powers and international powers, above all Russia, this cross border was closed since 2020 after the UN resolution, after using the veto by Russia and China. Despite the calls of the humanitarian organization, the autonomous administration, and even the residents of the camps to have or to reopen a cross border to receive humanitarian aid. And since that time, we are calling for reopening a new cross border, to reopen cross border between our regions and the occupied region by Turkey and the regions of the regime. There's also another serious danger, another threat, which helps ISIS sleeper cells to reactivate ISIS sleeper cells, which try to create chaos and problems and take over the camp and other region, also in coordination with the detained ones in the prisons or in the detained centers. This threat is the repeated attacks by Turkey with drones and warplanes on our region, and also bombing the vicinity of Al Hol camp, aiming to create chaos within the camp so that the families and the women and the kids in this camp can take over the camp and reorganize themselves. And on the other hand, there is a war. There is a war among the Iranian militias and the coalition forces. This is also had a role in reactivating ISIS sleeper cells. According to the information that the SDF got and the security forces got, that there was an attack being prepared by ISIS with coordination and support from the other side of the Euphrates and Turkey to so as a result of that, on the 27th of this month, the SDF conducted an operation within the camp, and more than 81 were arrested, and more weapons were captured, and more explosive materials also were captured within the camp. Of course, the threat of this ISIS sleeper cells, they threat the people who wants to get out from this ideology, to leave this ideology. These cells threat the humanitarian organization working in the camp, and in 2023, the Kurdish Red Crescent Center was attacked, and paramedic Bassam Hamad was killed as a result. And also they attacked a center belonging to the Doctors Without Border. Also, these actions are continuing within the camp. Also, there are schools to teach the kids this ideology, the ideology of ISIS, and training them on using weapons. And also, they threat the residents of the camps and the humanitarian organization which are working in the camp. And also, there is a big number of ISIS-linked families in the camp. They are Syrians, Iraqis, and also they are foreigners. To find a solution for this issue, for this international issue, all the international community need to be united, and especially the UN and the European Union, and also the Arab countries also are concerned in this matter. They need to support the Trump's administration with establishing rehabilitation centers within the camp, and they need to help them in terms of security, economy. There's absence or there's a lack of the resource that the Trump's administration can give to the camp. If this did not happen, new generation will come and they could follow the footsteps of ISIS and pose a disaster. The infrastructure are destroyed in the region after the Turkish bombs, and therefore there are shortages in terms of fuel, and also the water is non-drinkable, as Alok water station, which was supplying the Hasaki city and the camps affiliated to, as the whole is affiliated with the Hasaki city. There be a disaster in these terms. Also, there are shortages in terms of medicines, medical centers. Also, there is no enough support. Also, the World Health Program is not helping, and they reduced their support. They announced that they will reduce their support to the camps, and also lots of organizations have left the camp after the Turkish attacks. This also had a negative impact on the residents in the camp. Therefore, we also can. There are also lots of families which are now out of the camp, as the Times administration have a project regarding that in Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and Manbij and Tabqa. There are lots of families and people. Since 2019 and up to now, we are continuing this operation of returning back the people to their region, but the support to the Times administration is really little, and the help that we receive is really little, and we need to be prepared to confront the new generation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hammond. So we will have the Q&A. So if you have any questions or any clarity, especially with the translation, we will be happy to help you at that point in time. Up next, we have Ms. Punan Tanisha, and she will give you her advice now. Ms. Tanisha.
I'm a journalist with the BBC News in London, and I have spent about 18 months, so 2022 to 2023, producing a 7-part narrative podcast called Bloodlines for the BBC and CBC in Canada. And essentially what that explored is the fate of the thousands of children who were either taken to live under the IS caliphate by their families or those who were born there. And essentially what has happened to them after IS was defeated back in 2019. So as part of production for that podcast, I traveled to Syria on a number of occasions, and I visited the camps, the detention centers or rehabilitation centers and prisons where suspected IS militants and their families are being held in northeast Syria. So I'm not going to provide any analysis on what I think should happen or provide any opinions. I'm simply going to tell you all what we found. So first of all, when we traveled, and what I should say is that as part of that reporting, I spoke to a number of children. I mean, that was really the focus of my reporting. It was the fate of these children, the conditions under which they live. Now, I think that there's a universal acceptance. I think that I certainly know that the British government has said that the children who are currently being held in northeast Syria are the innocent victims of war. The camps in northeast Syria, Al-Hol, Al-Raj, they're no place for children to live, yet we know that thousands do. And there is no meaningful education. They are living a makeshift life. There's inadequate healthcare. And I think what also needs to be stated is that in those camps remain women who continue to have loyalties towards IS. And certainly Al-Hol is a dangerous place. A few weeks before we traveled back in 2022, 2 children were found murdered in a sewer. And there had been a security raid by the SDF and partners just a few weeks before. It was clear weapons are often smuggled in, people are smuggled out. So these are not stable places for children to live. Also, what happened when we traveled to Syria back in November 2022 is I was actually at the airport in Vienna when Turkey launched a series of airstrikes at SDF targets in northeast Syria. Some narrowly missed, I think, well, some hit the outer perimeter of Al-Hol camp, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly terrifying considering how many children live there or are held there. And these are children mainly under 12. So what we found is that it's geopolitically an unstable place, but also the conditions in the camps, as I mentioned, are pretty awful. And I think for me, one of the most powerful moments is when I visited a cemetery near Al-Hol. And there was a tiny graveyard where the children who died in Al-Hol are buried. And there were hundreds of graves. And sadly, I think one of the most shocking moments for me was the fact that there were so many fresh graves and there were babies. And I think that kind of illustrates just the peril within which those children continue to live. We also visited Al-Raj, the smaller camp. It's slightly more organized. And we spoke to a number of children. And this is what I always remember about them. And I've spoken about this a lot in the podcast. We dedicate an entire episode to these children. We call it the Forgotten Children. And in this episode, we have a group of children of various ages or people that were taken as children and are now men, who really enunciate their fears and hopes for the future. We spoke to kids who were like 3 or 4. They know nothing else. They can't remember anything else. The camps are all they know. And then we spoke to older children, and I spoke to a boy who was about 12 or 13. And his greatest fear is that he will be moved away from his mother and his family into a rehabilitation center like Al-Huri. He's heard that happens to boys, and he's pretty scared. And then I also spoke to a young girl who was 16. Now she wants to be a teacher. She was taken to live under IS, I think when she was about 10, 11, possibly. She has lived through unimaginable horrors. And she told me something about the fact that she just pretty much stays in her tent all day because it is the only way that she can block out where she is. And I think she's aware of the fact that the time is passing. And the question we asked throughout the podcast is this a race against time for these children to come home? And then we went to the actual rehabilitation center, Al-Huri, where we met a group of boys, and they were Trinidadian. And for these boys, they are between 18 to 21. And I think for all three, there was a real fear about what happens next. If they're not repatriated, where do they go? What will happen to them? They can't stay in a rehabilitation center for boys forever. So for them, there's a real fear that somehow they may be moved into an adult men's prison with battle-hardened IS fighters. We spoke to one boy, his name's Sule. He's an incredibly talented footballer. And he, as Letta mentioned, he spoke of the fact that he actually thought when he left Trinidad that he was going to visit the pyramids in Egypt. That was the story that he was told. He talked about seeing other boys being forced onto the battlefield and being killed. He has some memories shortly after IS was defeated of being taken to an adult male's prison for a short period of time. And he enunciated the fear that may happen to him. But there was one question all the older children asked me, and that was, like, have they been forgotten? And it's really hard. It was very, very hard for me as a journalist to answer that question or know how to answer it. And the answer that I gave and the answer that you can hear on the podcast is that they haven't been forgotten because there are people who are campaigning to bring them back. Now, also as part of the podcast, we reported on a Canadian family. Now, the Canadians, most of the women and children have now been repatriated since we were in the camps. And this particular Canadian family had incredibly notorious links. The mother was married to, I guess, the worst of the worst when it comes to IS, Al-Shafi al-Sheikh, from the militant group dubbed the IS Beatles, the group that I think many of you will remember, who kidnapped and beheaded Western aid workers and journalists on camera. And we interviewed her when she was in the camp, and we challenged her about her experiences of living under IS. But also what I found interesting was actually seeing her children, who were very young at the time. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because I think there are protection issues here, but who were living a difficult life. They were very, very young. Now, they have since been repatriated, and I have met them. I traveled to Toronto to meet them essentially, I think, 4 months ago. They were repatriated last April, and I met them in October. And all I can say is I spent a couple of days with the family. She is being treated, I mean, basically the justice system in Canada is dealing with her. She's on a peace bond while she's being investigated. But what I will say about her children is that the measures to try and reintegrate them and rehabilitate them have been quite extraordinary. I went on the school run with them, and it was almost like they were different children from the camp. And I think what really brought it home to me is something that she said, which is what I will leave you with, is that some of the questions that they ask now is, like, when they went to school for the first time, where are the soldiers? Because they were so used to seeing soldiers in the camp. And also, why were we left in the camp for so long? Why did you not bring us home sooner? And I think that is the certain questions that we really focus on in this podcast, which is it a race against time to bring these children back? Because as the American State Department often says, and indeed they told us this on the podcast, is that the longer that you leave kids there, the more exposed they are to radicalization, the more exposed they are to threats like IS, who remain active. They may have lost their territory, but their ideology lives on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Tanisha, sorry. I think that your experiences will be very insightful to know what is going on there, your visits to Syria and all these camps. So any questions for her, we'll take them after. Now we have Mr. Patricio Galvez, sorry. I think he needs an interpreter.
Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Patricio Galvez y hoy
Good
tengo el privilegio
afternoon,
de estar
everyone.
aquí con ustedes
My
para
name is
compartir
Patricio
una
Galvez.
historia de dolor, de
I
esperanza y
feel
lucha.
privileged and
Como
honored to
muchos de
be
ustedes
here
saben,
with you
soy
today
padre de
to
una
share
hija
a
que
story of
perdió la vida en
pain,
Siria
hope,
y
and a
abuelo
lot
de
of
7
struggle.
niños que
As you know,
estuvieron
I am the
estuvieron
father of a
atrapados
daughter
en los
who
campos
lost
de
her life in
detención
Syria, and I am
de Al-Hol en
grandfather
el
to
norte de
7
Siria.
children who were
Además, soy uno de
trapped
los
in the
cofundadores
detention
de
camps in Al-Hol in the
Repatriation,
north of Syria.
RTC,
I am one
que
of
es una
the
organización
co-founders
no
of
gubernamental
Repatriate
y
the
sin fines de
Children,
lucro,
RTC,
que se
which
dedica a
is
proteger, a
an
velar los derechos de los
NGO
niños que se encuentran en zonas de conflicto.
that
El
seeks to
propósito de
protect
mi
the rights
discurso
of
hoy
children
es
in
resaltar la
conflict zones.
importancia crítica de proteger
The purpose of my presentation today is to highlight the critical importance of protecting the rights of children in the midst of armed conflict. The story of my grandchildren is testimony to the bravery and perseverance and struggle that are required to guarantee dignity and to guarantee the future of children affected by violence and conflict. Without further ado, I'm going to share with you the story of my grandchildren and how their story, their experiences have inspired our work at RTC. Just a few years ago, at the beginning of 2019, I found myself in a harrowing, desperate situation. My daughter lost her life in Syria and she left 7 orphaned children who were trapped in the Al-Hol concentration camps. Faced with this personal tragedy, I had this incredible challenge, which was bringing my children, my grandchildren, to Sweden, where they would have the opportunity to live a safe life, to live with dignity. And that's what inspired me to co-found Repatriate the Children. I realized that this personal challenge was just one example of a much bigger problem. The lack of protection that children suffer within conflict areas throughout the world. And in order to address this humanitarian crisis, we founded RTC. It is an organization that focuses on protecting the rights of children in war situations. The story that my grandkids faced in Syria was a story of survival. They lost their mother and they were under the care of their father, who took them with him on a dangerous journey through a country hit by cruel conflict. For months, they faced inhumane conditions. They had no food, no clean water, as they fought for their survival in the midst of violence and uncertainty. Their situation reached a critical point when they ended up in Al-Baghouz, the last bastion of the Islamic State, where they witnessed a devastating offensive led by the coalition under the United States. They were literally buried alive while fire and white phosphorus rained on them. Bombs. My 7 grandkids faced imminent death, and yet they miraculously survived. In the face of adversity and demonstrating immense resilience. That experience is a powerful reminder of the strength of the human spirit and of the capacity to overcome the most difficult circumstances. Their story is an inspiring tale of hope and courage in the midst of darkness. While I desperately sought help to rescue my grandchildren, I faced so many obstacles, so much rejection. In spite of numerous attempts to obtain help from the Swedish government and from humanitarian organizations such as the Red Cross and Save the Children, I felt completely powerless in the face of their disinterest and their inability to act. Bureaucracy, lack of action stood in my way. They made me feel profoundly frustrated and desperate. When I discovered the difficult situation that my grandchildren were facing through harrowing video and news I felt so much rage and pain to see so many children suffering in the midst of war and violence. That inspired me to act with urgency in order to protect the most vulnerable. That is what led me at the end of March 2019 to embark on a trip to Syria to save my grandchildren. I was inspired by my love for my grandchildren and knowing that this was a deeply humanitarian cause. I went off on my own and I begged the Kurds in Syria for clemency for these innocent children. And I asked for their forgiveness on behalf of all of the children who had joined the IS militias. And in spite of challenges and so much adversity, I was able to open doors and borders in these areas completely devastated by madness and war. Finally, at the end of 2019, my efforts bore fruits and I was able to bring my 7 grandchildren back to Sweden, safe and sound. This was a feat that was only possible thanks to my own continuing efforts and faith. And it's proof that even an individual can do anything if they act with hope and love and perseverance. And the main thing that I wanted to say is that in the face of such a profound human tragedy, we must understand that bureaucracy and a complex legislative machinery cannot be an obstacle to human efforts to save lives. It is absolutely unacceptable that bureaucracy allows states to do nothing in the face of all of these human rights violations. Governments often act only on the basis of public opinion. And so I urge the international community to protect the rights of children in conflict areas. It is crucial for us to adopt concrete and effective action to make a tangible difference in the lives of these children who are facing absolutely harrowing circumstances and situations. I would like to urge each and every one of you to act to defend the fundamental rights of children all over the world and in all circumstances. And I would like to express my deepest gratitude to all of the people who have helped me in this journey. The Kurds of Rojava for their support, their empathy, their solidarity, which were a ray of hope in the darkness and adversity that I faced. In closing, I would like to express my optimism and gratitude for the support received thus far, tempered, however, with the knowledge that there is still so much to do. Together, we have to work together to build a world where no child has to suffer the atrocities of war. And where the rights of children are protected without exception. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Galvez. And thank you for sharing your story with us. We'll ask you further questions in our question and answer section. Now we have Ms. Sarita Asraf. Ms. Sarita Asraf, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. You can begin.
Many thanks. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad for the opportunity to speak about the situation in the camps northeast Syria. I'm an international criminal lawyer from Trinidad and Tobago, and I've been working on accountability for ISIL crimes, but also as part of that situation in northeast Syria as well. My presentation today is going to focus on under the rubric of trafficking, and particularly women and children who may be trafficking victims held by ISIL and now being held in camps and in prisons in northeast Syria. As we know, as of June 2023, more than 14 countries, I think actually 14 countries have repatriated more than 2,000 of their nationals from northeast Syria. That includes hundreds of children. Unfortunately, Trinidad is, as Letta said, still not amongst the countries that have brought their nationals back. Often when we think about those that are what we call ISIL or ISIL affiliated individuals in northeast Syria, we discuss them under the terms of potentially a counterterrorism framework, usually in some cases under a criminal accountability framework, and then of course under the rubric of repatriation without and protection. What I want to speak about today is trafficking. It's something that is actually not often discussed and very poorly understood, but it is incredibly relevant to conversations about the situation of women and girls and boys and sometimes men in northeastern Syria. And it's incredibly relevant when we're talking about what are the obligations of states with nationals and descendants of nationals who are abroad. So I'm just going to start out with a little bit of legalese, so you'll have to forgive me, but I think if we're going to speak about trafficking, then we should have a good idea of what trafficking is. So there is an internationally accepted definition of trafficking from a UN protocol, which is generally known as the Palermo Protocol. And it requires three elements to be met for adults, and that is an action, which could be recruitment, transportation, transferring, receiving a person, and that it be carried out through a particular means, including use of force or threat of use of force or other forms of coercion, which could be, for example, deception or abuse of a position of vulnerability for the purposes of exploitation, including slavery or practices similar to slavery. For adults, you need all three elements, but for children, you only need the action or the purpose, because children cannot consent to their own intended exploitation. It's already well recognized in the human rights law around trafficking that forced marriage is recognized as a slavery-like practice and a form which is a form of exploitation that has been specifically recognized in the Palermo Protocol. Additionally, the Special Rapporteur in Trafficking of Persons has highlighted that a change of circumstances may result in a relationship or a marriage that was freely entered into becoming a situation of trafficking for the purposes of exploitation, forced marriage, forced labor, or forced criminality. So one can start off essentially not being trafficked and then become trafficked due to the change in circumstances. Under international human rights law, it's really important that victims of trafficking be identified as early as possible to ensure their rights and prevent further re-traumatization. The CEDAW committee, the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, requires all duty bearers to establish procedures to identify possible victims of trafficking, including those suspected of association with or returning from a territory under the control of non-state armed groups, such as the Islamic State was, as a first step to ensuring their rights. Countries who have nationals or permanent residents in northeast Syria, such as Trinidad and Tobago, also have an obligation to identify victims of trafficking, including where persons were trafficked from the home countries, for example, through online recruitment or were taken over by people who were de facto recruiters, and to repatriate them if they wish to return. So there's a number of different legal rights that are of the victims and also of the state. I should say that when we speak about victims and perpetrators, which is pretty common in international criminal law where I practice, it is really useful in some situations, but it's also one should be very cautious with these kind of binaries, because yes, there may be people who are only perpetrators and there may indeed be people who are only victims, but actually in a lot of instances, you have people who were victimized in some situations and potentially perpetrated crimes in others. So it's a mistake to think that there's a really clearly drawn line across a number of years as to whether one falls into one group or one falls into another. Often it's a mix of both, and that it can change quite significantly over time. What we know in having studied the Islamic State, having studied Islamic State ideology and conduct, is that many people who are now treated as ISIL affiliated and who are detained in internment camps such as Al-Hul or in detention facilities, including boys who were in the camp and then removed from the camp when they hit age 13, 14, 15, and taken essentially into a prison system with adult males in some cases, were in fact trafficked by ISIL. And we see a real recognition of the trafficking of people when it comes to, for example, the Yazidis. So even up to last week, we had Yazidi women and their children being rescued from Al-Hul. They had been captured by ISIL in an August 2014 attack on Sinjar and usually entered into a system of enslavement, including sexual enslavement, and held with the group, and in some cases threatened by the group or too fearful to make themselves known to the Kurdish forces who are in charge of the camp. For Yazidi women, it's a very straightforward process of being identified as a victim of crimes and being trafficked, which indeed they are. When it comes to other women who are not part of minorities, particularly Sunni women who may have either been Syrian or Iraqi living in situations where ISIL took over, or else foreign women who were either brought in via coercive means or through deception into the territory of the then Islamic State, it is very unusual for them to be recognized as trafficking victims, even though most of them that have been documented would fall within the victim of a trafficking victim. So we saw, for example, the trafficking of women and girls for the purposes of forced marriage and the trafficking of boys to train and fight as soldiers. And some of those of us that have been working and looking at the Trinidadians held in Al-Hul or held in Roj camps can see really specific instances, not in all cases, but in some instances, of women and children brought over through deceptive means or who were brought in willingly and then proceeded to enter into a system of trafficking. So one of the ways that the Islamic State trafficked people, and there were multiple different ways, was to confine women and girls in the system of the women's guest houses or madafas until they agreed to marry someone from a list provided. Madafas are essentially detention facilities in that you can only leave once you agree to get married and then get married. And so there's a number of different sources about it. There'll be more reports coming about it soon, but documentation of women who've gone through the Mudafa system describe really being locked inside houses that were crowded, armed guards being positioned outside to prevent them from escaping, their phones being taken, their passports being taken, and then essentially saying they would go to like kind of look-sees where a man would come in, they would have a meeting, a chaperoned meeting with this man, and then it was only if they agreed to marry him they could get out. If someone is in a marriage, whether it was consensual or coerced through the Mudafa system, and that man then dies, which was obviously not unusual, and particularly not unusual in the period of 2017 to 2019, the women or girls are then returned to the Mudafa to go through the entire system again, because the Islamic State really saw single women as a threat to societal order, and therefore it was not really possible to live as a single woman or even potentially a single girl post-puberty in the territory of the Islamic State. We also see patterns of forced marriage of girls between 12 and 16 years old. We've had some cases for example, in Sweden, where mothers have been prosecuted, mothers being the ones who survived, usually being prosecuted for taking their children into the territory of the Islamic State, knowing that the girls would likely be removed from them and forced to marry, and the boys would be removed and taken to cub camps. I know my talk is a little bit is mainly focuses on women and girls, but I just want to use 30 seconds just to focus in on men and young boys. Gendered understandings often indicate that we view males, and particularly males who are post-puberty, as essentially threats. They're often a group that's very hard to get people to agree to repatriate, but in fact, they are often victims themselves. The UN Commission of Inquiry in Syria reported that ISIS used and systematically recruited children for direct participation in hostilities and established cub camps across its territories where boys of various backgrounds were trained for combat roles and suicide missions. That has been, Syrian Observatory observed that children as young as 8 were placed into that. According to consistent descriptions, ISIS recruited, transported, harbored boys, including in cubs of the Caliphate counts, and used these children to prepare for and engage in military operations and other activities. The use of children by arms groups is a recognized purpose of exploitation under the trafficking description, and the recruitment and use of children nearly always constitutes trafficking, including where the groups that the children are being recruited into are listed as terrorist groups. Some states have followed really restrictive repatriation practices, for example, only repatriating orphans or children. Some states have made decisions not to repatriate all or certain categories of nationals, notably men and boys over, for example, the age of 15, but they've done so without trying to see whether they are human rights compliant and making an assessment of whether these categories of individuals have in fact been trafficked. And when they do so, the states are in breach of their obligations to prevent, investigate, and punish trafficking, as well as their obligations to identify and provide remedies for trafficking victims. Those who are most in danger of being left out are, in fact, boys who were brought in as boys and who now have been there for so long that they've essentially aged into adulthood. They were underage when they were brought in, often brought in without a great degree of agency, sometimes brought in by their parents or by step parents or by an adult associated with the family, and now have become young adults usually within actually the time that they're in Al Hol now, because they've now probably been in Al Hol almost as long or longer than they were in the territory of the Islamic State. Often they're excluded from repatriation policies without an assessment of whether they have been trafficked. The conversation around trafficking in the camps is very limited. It means that these issues aren't necessarily being raised by those in the camps when they have access to journalists. They have very little access to lawyers, and states themselves are not engaging with the trafficking framework and their obligations when it comes to protection from trafficking and repatriation of trafficking victims. I'm happy to speak more about it. I know I'm probably out of time by now for my 10 minutes, so I'm going to leave it there. And if anyone has any questions about the legal aspects and the obligations of states, I'm happy to take those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Asraf. Again, you could post your questions in the chat so that when we have the question and answer session, we'll be able to attend to those questions. And thank you for that information about trafficking and all the other challenges and issues associated with, these detainees within Syria. So to add to that information, we have Dr. Timothy Afonso. He's at the University of the West Indies. Mr. Afonso.
Yes, good afternoon and thank you, everyone. So I'm grateful to come after Sarita, who was a nice segue into the legal dimensions. I will be speaking on the entitlement to return and from a human rights dimension. And I think it's important when we discuss this issue that the persons who are at the heart of the issue of repatriation are voiceless objects. And because of that, it's important for us to deconstruct what the legal regime is that regulates the right of an individual to return to his or her country of nationality. And if you look at any of the major international human rights treaties, whether we look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, or we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you will see that there is an inherent right of an individual to nationality. And the reason it's important for us to go back to that starting point is that if we understand the right to return to a country is grounded in the principle of nationality, you will understand why states have approached the issue the way they have. Now, if we look at the ICCPR in particular, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it provides at Article 12.4 that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his own country. So we have to determine what does this arbitrary deprivation look like? And the Human Rights Committee in General Comment number 27 provides that the concept of arbitrariness is intended to emphasize that it applies to all states' actions and that there are few, if any, circumstances in which restrictions of the right to enter one's country could be reasonable. So therefore, even the monitoring body for the treaty recognizes that arbitrary is a very high test. What states have tried to do is they use a political discourse on a social issue to fearmonger. So they use the concept of national security. But there's no evidence that supports the view that national security concerns are a reason for one, persons to not be able to return to their country, even if they had been involved in ISIS, or two, that's the first one is to let them come back, and the second one is to bring them back. And there are cases, and we'll get to the cases in a short bit. But we have to get even further, and I think a point clearly pointed out by Letta and Poonam is the unique vulnerability of children. And Sarita goes further and talks about women as well. It's important to recognize that in some situations, and I would say maybe for children, in some situations for women, they become the objects of this decision to move to Syria. And when we think of what the nationality requirement is under treaties, for example, if we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 8, it says that states parties undertake to respect the right of the child to preserve his identity, including nationality. So if we can say that a right of an individual, of a citizen, of a national is to return to the country, then there are things that the state can do if they don't want the person to return to the country. And one of those things is the general idea of denationalization, the idea that we revoke nationality. And we will come to the British case of Bigham, where the British government actually revoked the nationality of a 15-year-old girl who went to join ISIS. And she was then denied, or her citizenship was stripped, thereby allowing the government not to allow her to return to the UK. Now that must be compared with another national case in the UK. And that case is the case of R. and Darren Osborne in 2018. This is a British citizen who also committed an act of terrorism in the UK, and they were sentenced to life. So even if we wanted to say that Shamima Begum committed an act of terrorism, we have two different penalties for persons who may have committed the same type of offense. That demonstrates that there is an inequity. There is a lack of consistency in how the law is applied. And that is another breach of an international obligation, the right of due process and to be treated equally before the law, and the concept of non-discrimination. But when we think of denationalization, while states may be doing it to justify barring individuals from re-entering, the law is that revoking nationality as a measure to prevent persons from returning to your country is a violation of international law. And most times, it will be combined with a breach of a state to avoid creating stateless persons. And if we look at the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, it provides quite clearly in Article 4 that the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness instructs states to grant nationality to persons not born in that country if at the time of their birth, the parents were nationals. So this, I want to say, it's an extraterritorial feature of nationality, where persons may have traveled to Syria. The children may have been born there, and an argument may be raised that these are not Trinidadian nationals, or these are not nationals of a specific country. We have to start by thinking that nationality is determined by domestic laws. So it has to be that the national laws of a country facilitate the granting of nationality through birth. But once that exists, it would be a breach of international law for a state to revoke nationality on the basis that the person engaged in an act of terror. And there is a case, a very important case coming out of the European Court of Human Rights. It's called HF and others against France. These were persons who had, some of them were children who had gone across to Syria from France. And the idea was, is the French government under a legal obligation to repatriate its citizens back to France? And the Grand Chamber of the court held that there was no such obligation to repatriate nationals. But that is not all they said. They then went on to say that it does impose positive obligations. A positive obligation is a duty on a state to do something. And where that positive obligation occurs, the state is actually under a duty to ensure that its inaction does not result in something known as de facto exile. That means a state cannot decide not to repatriate citizens, but in essence, result in their citizens existing in a place where they are exiled. from their country of origin. And within this discussion, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has a different view from what the ECHR has in respect of children, because the Committee on the Rights of the Child adopts the view that when it relates to children, there is an obligation to repatriate them, whereas the European Court has the view that the state must not repatriate, but they must provide appropriate safeguards to prevent arbitrariness in examining requests for repatriation. I suppose this is a court that is trying to be a little bit more diplomatic, but in essence, what they're saying is that you don't have to bring them back, but you must fairly consider their request. So when we look at the totality of the treaties, the international cases, and the domestic cases, what we are seeing quite clearly is that persons seem to be confused, and let me say governments seem to be confused as to what exactly is their way out of the issue of a person who may have fled to engage in acts of terror, and now they realize, or they may not have actually done that, and now they want to come back, but by mere association, they are being branded a terrorist. And I believe the UN Security Council Resolution 2178 of 2014 answers the question. The resolution provides, it calls on member states to criminalize acts that are preparatory to terrorism or that are terrorist in nature. If we go back to the British case of Darren Osborne in 2018, there was already domestic legislation in the UK that allowed the British government to adequately deal with the threat of someone who has committed an act of terrorism or who was about to commit an act of terrorism. That therefore means if government is of the view that a particular individual poses a threat to national security on the basis of their involvement, there is a process by which a government is supposed to determine whether that person, number one, did in fact engage in that, and number two, poses a threat to national security. And if they do, there is due process and entitlement under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to be tried, and if evidence is provided, then they are sentenced or appropriately. But the idea that a government has the ability to remove citizenship from an individual or to bar nationals from returning to a country on the basis of national security threats that are unfounded or not supported by evidence, that is a violation of international law. I think it's important for us to realize that as at December 2023, which is the most recent data I could find, Trinidad had repatriated none of its nationals. And in a December 18 response by the government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that it was committed to returning its nationals from northeast Syria and is making the necessary legislative and regulatory arrangements. I believe that that particular statement perhaps could be a glimmer of hope because it recognizes, in my view, a textual genuflection to the ideas reflected or expressed in the United Nations Security Council resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alfonso. We now open up the floor for a question and answer section. I do have a question and it goes to Mr. Hamid. There was a question posed about contacting your organization regarding, from the government of Trinidad and Tobago regarding persons, Trinidadians who are in Syria. I don't know if you could give some indication of how persons can contact your organization and offer assistance to Trinidadians who are in the Syrian camps.
We in the Autonomous Administration have called all the countries which have citizens and nationals in northeast Syria, whether they were in Hol camp or Rosh camp, to take back their citizens and nationals, and they can communicate through communicating with the coalition or also communicating with our Department of Foreign Affairs. So as well, the government of Tobago can communicate with us, can communicate with our Department of Foreign Affairs. They can send an email and we can communicate with each other, and they can also after send a special delegate to take back their nationals and citizens.
Okay. I hope that answers your question. Yes, your voice was clear. So the person who asked that question, I hope that answers your question. Do we have any questions coming from those who attended? So we had some insightful information from Ms. Tinisha about her experience being in Syria, having discussions with young persons about their future. My question would be, what is the driving force in those situations that propel them to think about the future in such, negative environments where you see that they're thwarted in terms of development, growth physically and educationally? What was their guiding light and their hope, especially if they think that they are lost in Syria? Like, what were some of the things that kind of pretty much give them inspiration?
Well, I think there's very little inspiration, I think, without meaning to be so pessimistic. So the way I describe it or I interpret it is it's a mix of small dreams and big dreams that some of them still hold on to. So as I mentioned, there was the boy who's 12, 13. He's holding onto hope of actually going to school, because he's heard that in Trinidad, school lasts all day, there are sports, there are opportunities to do certain classes. So that's the hope he's holding on to. The girl is holding on to hope that one day she will train to be a teacher. And then we have, of course, the boys, the older boys in the rehabilitation centers. One is still has dreams of being a professional footballer. That's what's keeping him going. The other two, one wanted to be a games designer. The other one just wanted to go to university. So I think it's with the older kids, it's the memories of what they know exist in their home countries. And I think for the younger kids, it's what they're being told. And I think for the very, very little kids, they're probably the most content. Like the 4 and 5-year-old kids there, they look really happy in Al Raj if you see them. They're on their scooters, they've got their Wellington boots. They look pretty content because they know nothing else. To them, this is really all they know.
Okay. And one other question. This is a really hard question, and this is a question that most governments would ask about the idea of radicalization. Do you see them at any point in time exhibiting any sort of radical, behaviors, or what can we do? I should rephrase that. What can we do in the reintegration process to ensure that the trauma that they have experienced is not reflected in the countries or their home countries?
I mean, what I can answer, and I'm not an expert, it's only from actually kids who I know have returned, is that there needs to be a lot of work done to support those kids, because they have lived through unimaginable horrors. And I think there are certain countries that are actually doing that are giving them the psychological support they need, the pastoral support they need. I mean, one of the women who I mentioned earlier, who's Canadian, she was saying that actually kids in the camp were quite, there was a lot of hitting. There was a lot of kind of, a bit of immunity towards violence. And I have to say, actually, some of the women themselves in the camp said that they were really worried about some of the behavior that their children were exhibiting. As I said, there are women who remain loyal to IS and its ideology in those camps. So you do still hear about kids saying things like, the unbelievers should be killed, thoughts like that, sentences like that. So the thing is, I think it's about, I've only seen a small glimpse of people who've returned, of children who've returned, but I think it is about recognizing what they've experienced and being able to support that. And kids are resilient. It's incredible, really. We know that children are really resilient.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your contribution. We do have another question, and this comes from Alicia.
Sorry, just Sorry, this is Sarita.
Yes.
I just want to add a note on the last question, which is that I think it's really important that we highlight and learn from countries which have repatriated the nationals. And there has now been quite significant numbers of children and women, in some cases men, being repatriated. And from the children, obviously, there are different support systems and different programs that we can learn from. But one of the things that has been really apparent is that the children have been able to reintegrate with the proper support. So one, I would say children are not a homogenous group. Not all children are going to react the same way. In some cases in the Islamic State territory, some children had been shielded from the more immediate violence of the Islamic State. Some had more indoctrinated parents or guardians and they were less shielded. In some cases, children are much more traumatized, in fact, by the airstrikes and the forced displacements that led them to getting to Al-Hol than necessarily what they saw in the Islamic State, depending on how protective their household was. But it's worth learning and spending more time for the Trinidad and Tobago government to learn from the programs that have been put in place by other countries that brought the nationals back and where they've seen success. But across the board, there has been very successful repatriation and reintegration of children who come back to their home countries. I would also add that a lot of these children should never have been allowed to leave Trinidad and Tobago, that there was a failure from Trinidad and Tobago in allowing some of these children to exit these countries. In some cases, in several of the cases that I am aware of, the children exited only with the father or sometimes stepfather without the permission of the mother or with only the permission of one parent. So there's some things that they were let down on when they were taken out of the country in circumstances where they've been stopped. So the question of how their state of trauma and their reactions, those are good questions, but they don't remove the obligation of the countries to which they're nationals of, including Trinidad and Tobago, from their obligations to their nationals, and particularly where those nationals have been the victims of crimes and the victims of trafficking.
Okay, thank you so much for that contribution. We do have a question, and I would like to, I think probably Dr. Afonso might be able to help, I'm not sure. Do we know how many Trinidad and Tobago nationals are in Syrian camps at this time? And because there may be new births, I'm not certain, well, she says the first time, I'm not certain. So I don't know if we have a number, if we have an estimate at this point in time.
Last number I know is 90, but that would have been at February of 2023.
Right.
I don't know, and that would have included about maybe 20 children. But I'm sure those numbers are unreliable now.
Okay.
And this is based on a Human Watch report.
Okay, so hopefully that answers the question. Based on the Human Watch report, we have approximately 90. You said
90. It was 90.
So yeah, last time he checked, so we're uncertain. It probably is not really the most reliable. I'm trying to see if there are any other questions. Mr. Galvez, and the process of bringing back your 7 grandchildren, could you tell me some of the obstacles that they faced in the reintegration process, and what are some of those things or challenges that we have to look out for in any other country, any country that are trying to repatriate detainees and children from Syria? I know he needed an interpreter. Yeah.
En el caso de mis nietos,
In the case of my grandchildren,
afortunadamente ellos
was
fueron
fortunately for
sacados
them,
de los campamentos
they
muy
were
rápidamente.
removed
Afortunadamente,
very quickly
los
from the
logré sacar. Yo
camps.
creo que estuvieron viviendo
Fortunately,
exactamente en el campo de
I was able
Al-Hol
to do
unos 2
this
meses,
because they live in
y eso
Al-Hol at
facilitó
least 2 months, and this
que la
facilitated
reintegración de ellos
that
al
the
llegar a Suecia fue
reintegration
mucho más
process
rápido.
for them, once they
Por
arrive
eso
in
que es
Sweden, it
muy,
was
muy, muy
faster.
importante
Therefore, it is very
que la
critical
repatriación de los niños sea lo
that
más pronto
repatriation
posible.
of children
Eso va a
be done
asegurar
as quickly as
que
possible. This will guarantee
que su reintegración a la
that
sociedad, donde van
the
a llegar, sea
reintegration to
mucho más rápida
society
y
where
se
they will arrive
asegure
will be faster,
que los
and
niños
it
no
will
sufran esa
assure that the
radicalización
children don't
que
suffer
comentaban hace un rato,
radicalization, which was
que es
mentioned
muy
before,
palpable.
which is easy to
La
see
forma,
the way
cómo se tratan, cómo se vive
how the
en los campos de
children
concentración o los campos
dealt with
de
and
detención
the
de
life in
Al-Hol,
these concentration camps and the
la
detention camps in Al-Hol.
radicalización de los niños, de los
Radicalization
jóvenes, es muy
of
fuerte. Por eso
children and the youth is very, very
para mis
strong.
nietos fue tuvo una
For my
gran
grandchildren,
fuerza haber
they were
llegado
very
lo más pronto
fortunate
posible y
that
recibir una ayuda
I
psicológica.
arrived there
Ellos
quickly.
van,
They arrived into Sweden. They received the
ellos están
adequate
yendo
psychological
a
assistance.
rehabilitación
They are
psicológica, donde le hacen
to
exámenes y están
rehabilitation, where
constantemente
psychological
revisando
examinations,
sus
where they
traumas.
live. They are
Afortunadamente
being
los niños
evaluated
mayores
in
que
their
habían vivido más
traumas
y que habían visto muchas
continuously.
más cosas,
The older
vieron a
ones
su
who were
madre
there
morir,
longer and
vieron a
saw
su padre
more
morir.
things, they saw their mother
Ellos,
died, they saw their father
lógicamente, han
died.
presentado mayores
Logically,
dificultades para
they show
aclimatizarse,
greater
pero
difficulty
ya estamos
to
hablando de
reintegrate,
prácticamente
but
5 años.
we are talking
Y hoy en
about
día
5
ellos
years.
prácticamente
And
no
today,
demuestran nada
they don't
de traumas
show
y se han
any
aclimatizado
form of
perfectamente a la
trauma,
sociedad.
and they
Ellos van a la
have
escuela, son
become
niños
very
súper alegres,
accustomed to the society. They go to school,
que
they are
en
happy
fondo no
children,
demuestran haber
and
estado
in
viviendo
the
lo que vivieron.
depth of their
Por
psyche
eso que es
don't
muy
show
importante
what they lived. And that
que
is
estos
why it is
niños se
very
les dé esa
important
nueva oportunidad
that
y
these children
vuelvan
be
a sus
given
países.
these opportunities to
Aunque haya
return to their
pasado mucho tiempo,
countries.
más tarde,
Whatever time
más
has
tarde
elapsed,
que nunca.
it is better late than never.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Ms. Taylor, I saw that you put some comments in there. I know you had just the opening speech. Could you just give us your point of view on this successful integration and especially the research that you have done? And this is just so that we can lead the questions, because I have some questions here about the repatriation process, but I'd like to hear some of your points that you put into the chat.
Yes, absolutely, and thank you. I would like to echo others who've spoken on this, including Patricio and Saretta. These children, so many of them, are doing magnificently upon return. I don't wish to suggest that there aren't challenges. Any child who's been through even a fraction of the trauma that these children have experienced are, of course, going to need a lot of help offered to them at a minimum, and maybe they don't necessarily need all of it, but services need to be in place to receive these children. But in the countries that Human Rights Watch has studied, which includes Sweden, where Patricio is from and where his grandchildren are finally happily now, these children in several countries around the world are doing remarkably well. A large number of them are at the top of their class, excelling in sports, learning to draw beautiful art, playing music, have all the kinds of aspirations that Poonam was describing, that were expressed by the children from Trinidad, but they actually have a chance to try to realize these aspirations now. And as Patricio said, better late than never. There has been a waiting game, I think, on the part of governments where they wait and wait and wait to commit to bringing people back, which is their legal obligation, as Deputy Dean Afonso and Sarita and I have pointed out. There are these legal obligations, but countries are just looking the other way and hoping that if they wait long enough, that they can say, it's too late. The children are now adults. Now they're not just ticking time bombs, they are bombs. This fear-mongering that was expressed by other panelists earlier. There is a tendency to let this just run its course and to try to get public opinion behind the idea of not lifting a finger to bring people home. So it's important that we remember how many success stories they are, and that to date, we've not had one terrorist incident that's been reported from those who've returned. In addition, those who've been repatriated by their governments. And I think it's also important to remember that hundreds and thousands, in some cases, of people from around the world who traveled to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS came back on their own before the fall of the so-called caliphate, and that in nearly all cases, these people have not posed a security risk either. So we're talking about masses of people who've come back. Is there a risk? Of course there's a risk. Is there a risk of crossing the street? Yes. Is there a risk of letting anyone who is a violent criminal in Trinidad out of prison? Yes, there are always risks. But a democracy cannot function by shutting down all risks, by looking at everything exclusively through the security prism. Rights and security are two pillars of international law, and they are pillars. You cannot support security without rights, and you cannot support rights without security. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much on giving us some insight on this. So we have some questions in the Q&A. I think most of them are towards Mr. Hamid. I will start with 1, 2, and 3. If any Trinidad and Tobago government official has contacted your organization, and there was actually a specific question specifically regarding repatriation, and also a question regarding a personal matter. So I will start with whether or not any Trinidad and Tobago official has contacted you about repatriation of Trinidad and Tobago citizens.
No, there was no communication between the Autonomous Administration and the government of Tobacco. There is no communication between our Office of External Relations and also the government of Tobacco. We hope that all the countries and states which have citizens and nationals in whether they were in the camps or the prisons to communicate with us, as the Autonomous Administration is working in coordination with the international coalition on holding trials of ISIS fighters who are in the prisons, and also to rehabilitate the kids and the women who are in the camp. We have 3 centers to rehabilitate the kids, but the capacity is small as our capabilities are limited. We hope that we receive support from all the countries regarding that, and we hope that the government of Tobago communicate with us, with the Office of External Relations and the Autonomous Administration. No, there was no communication between us and the government of Tobago, no communication between our Office of External Relations and the government of Tobago. We hope that all the states which have nationals and citizens, whether they were in the camps, the whole camp, or the prisons, as the Autonomous Administration is working in coordination with the international coalition to hold trials for ISIS fighters who are in the prison, and also to rehabilitate the kids and the women within the camp. We have 3 centers to rehabilitate the kids, but our capacity is so little as our capability is limited. We hope that we receive help and eyes from the whole countries. We hope that they communicate with us. We hope that the government of Tobago communicate with us, with the Autonomous Administration, and we will be ready to help with them.
Is there a response? No? I'm not sure what's going on with the translation. All right, so another question has been posed is, can anyone give information about the conditions of the persons who are of Trinidadians who are in Syria? I don't know who would like to take that question. If anybody knows of the conditions of Trinidadians specifically in Syria. And also the additional question will be, what is the status of their efforts to go home, I guess, to be repatriated? Anybody would like to respond to the question?
But I defer to Poonam if she prefers.
Go ahead, Letta.
Yeah, just to say that the conditions for all of these nationals are dire. We are talking about situations where there's not enough clean water, there's not enough medicine, where families have to go past guards and beg for permission to get into a clinic where there might not even be a doctor available. And this is in the camps, including Rouge camp, which is considered the better of the two camps. There's Rouge and then the much larger Al Hol camp. And the situation in prisons is even worse. Half of the child population in the prison, in the largest prison holding foreigners in Northeast Syria, in Al-Hasaka, half of that youth population is infected with tuberculosis, a particularly virulent form of tuberculosis because it's either been untreated for years or has been treated and then the treatment has stopped. I was really struck by what Poonam said about the graves for the children outside of Al Hol camp. There have been mass burials also of prisoners where as boys age out of camps, they will go to a place like Huri Center, which is a so-called rehabilitation center, and then they will be transferred to prisons. Many boys have gone missing in these prisons. There's a rather notorious case now of an Australian boy. It's not clear if he's dead or alive. This has been going on for a couple of years now. There's simply no clarity as to whether this person still exists anymore and if he doesn't, where his body is. And this could happen to any Trinidadian child at any time in this situation. This is a life and death scenario for these Trinidadians. And that's one reason that urgency is paramount. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So that gives us some insight into the resources that we have available. You heard from a panel of experts, lawyers, and we have a journalist that who gave us insight to what is happening. Now we have Ms. Taylor, who just provided some imperative information about just the conditions that they're facing. Mr. Ahmed, who is part of, the team, the organization that's helped with displaced persons. So we do have like a rich amount of information and expertise here. And we thank you so much. We now have the closing remarks and vote of thanks by Ms. Julia Nichols. So I'll hand it over to you to close, and then we will hopefully have our next webinar, and we hope to see you there. Ms. Nichols?
Thank you so much, Dr. Figaro.
Thank you.
Distinguished panelists and guests, greetings from New York. Allow me to express my gratitude to colleagues at the Institute of International Relations for organizing this webinar, and to the panelists for curating and sharing such a myriad of thought-provoking materials with us. It has been a privilege to hold space with you all today to discuss the very imperative topic of repatriation and reintegration as it pertains to returnees from Syria to Trinidad and Tobago. Before I move on to briefly summarizing a few key takeaways from our panelists today, I want to stress the importance of these events. Firstly, encouraging open dialogue to share ideas from experts and like-minded individuals in this field is a key component of the mission of the Institute of International Relations. Not only does it foster an environment for collaboration, but it bridges the gap between the theory and practice surrounding the research and work that the Institute facilitates, and provides an opportunity to showcase that the Institute is a formidable actor amongst its peers and colleagues in the field of international relations in the region. But most importantly, it gets the wheels spinning in the minds of the respective Trinidadians who hold positions of authority to make real change, as well as those abroad, who have first-hand experience with repatriation and reintegration efforts, who are very willing to assist us with adopting these methods for the seamless transitions when it comes to the circumstances surrounding repatriation efforts of our nationals. So, now for some key takeaways and themes explored here today. One being the plight of women and children in conjunction with the protection of their humanitarian rights, the legality surrounding repatriation and reintegration efforts, humanity, meaning recognizing the human element of these detainees, understanding more about their fears, for example, being forgotten or separated from their mothers, their hopes and their dreams, accountability, holding our governments and leaders accountable, the need to pressure them to act so as to avoid further damage, such as radicalization, exposure to risks and threats, and unjust persecution, and gender, how gendered biases play a role in repatriation efforts, fair trials, and perpetuating the cycle of victimization. Similarly, a few of the key takeaways from the last session were collaborative efforts, accountability, and networking and preparing communities for repatriation and return. From that same session, I'd like to quote Ms. Letta Taylor of the Crisis and Conflict Division at Human Rights Watch. She said, and I quote, that what happens with these detainees in Northeast Syria from 60 different countries is a global test case for human rights and the rule of law. I see that this sentiment was echoed today by our panelists, and it is reassuring to see that this is a common theme in our repatriation dialogues and efforts. Having had first-hand experience working on reintegration efforts of women in the UK who have had contact with the criminal justice system regarding acts or charges of terrorism or relations to terrorist activity, I can firmly agree that being on the same page and having synonymity in the way this issue needs to be tackled can only bring about successful outcomes. It is possible. With that being said, I'd like to extend a vote of thanks to the Institute of International Relations Secretariat, the Marketing and Communication Department of the U.W.I, Dr. Mikhail Powinski, Ms. Tanisha Charles, and to all of our distinguished panelists and guests for making this event today possible. We must continue to speak about this issue with the aim of bringing about fruitful outcomes for both the returnees and society alike. I thank you all.
Thank you everyone for participating. Have a good evening.